afternoon and welcome to this Sunday's version of the Full Scottish. Taking advantage of the fact that my guests can't be in the studio, we're going international today. I'm joined from the Netherlands by Frederike Geerdink, who is an independent journalist and author and an expert on Kurdistan. And from the Highlands, MSP Maree Todd, who is Highland MSP and also Minister for Young People and Children. Welcome to you both. Before we get to the programme proper, as usual, I'll just recap on the coronavirus statistics in Scotland up until 2 o'clock yesterday. So up until 2 p.m. on Saturday, there were 994 new confirmed cases of COVID. That's the first time it's been under 1,000 for a while. 60 new reported deaths of people who tested positive. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 1,563,498 people in Scotland have been tested. Of these, 1,384,816 tests were confirmed negative, meaning 178,682 tests were positive. As of last night, 1,952 people were in hospital, 142 of whom were in intensive care. And sadly, we've passed another milestone. As of yesterday, 6,100 patients who tested positive have died. 543,370 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, just over 10% of the population, and 7,638 have received their second dose. We're going to be talking about vaccines later in the programme because it's been a big story this week. But first of all, Maree, I wanted to ask you, there was a report came out this week that isolation for people suffering through the pandemic is particularly difficult in rural areas and particularly hard on young people. So that hits both your constituency and your ministerial profile. What are you finding up in Highland?
So I think on the rural issue, we know that isolation in rural areas can be quite severe. And we saw when we had the level framework, remember before Christmas, we saw a differentiation for the islands. What many communities in the Highlands and Islands don't have is a cafe that they can go to and meet as people, further south in the country might have. So we saw that differentiation then. And on the island, people were allowed to go into each other's houses because the rate of coronavirus was very low. Obviously, the situation has changed. The rate of coronavirus has risen absolutely everywhere in the country, including in the islands, and the whole country is in level 4. Many of the islands, other than the Western Isles, in level 3, but still very, very cautious about relaxing that household mixing because of this new variant. And undoubtedly, that causes isolation. There's just no way around it. We already live in reasonably isolated lives up here in the Highlands and Islands, and not being able to visit our neighbours and go to big supermarkets or shopping places is very, very difficult.
And particularly hard on young people, though.
Yeah, so I guess there's a challenge there with transport. So young people will often come together from quite a large geographical area to go to school together. My children had friendships from different towns and villages all meeting at school, and that's not possible at the moment. So there's that direct impact. In a city, you'd be more likely to be living quite closely to your friends from school. And I think, there's real challenges with connectivity, although actually, our broadband has been better than we thought. Many people are able to successfully work from home and study from home, but it hasn't been the way of life for us. And I think young people, so it's very, very clear to me, and it's very, very clear to everyone in government, just how important it is to be at school. And it's not simply a learning need. There's social and developmental needs that are met by children going to school together and mixing together and socialising. It's significantly more than learning is lost by schools being closed. So the impact on young people is more severe, I would say, than older people.
And are you concerned? And are you concerned that that's going to have an impact on poor mental health in young people? We know that there is a higher instance of self-harm in young people, especially young men. Is that something you're really concerned about after the pandemic has moved on?
Yes, very. We are really concerned about some of the. I mean, I think this pandemic has been very, very difficult for absolutely everyone,
Mm.
and everyone in the community has had to make sacrifices. But if I think about my own children, for example, they're, between 16 and 21. They should be out making independent relationships, finding their tribe. It's a really vital, key developmental stage of life, isn't it? And to be restricted and at home with your parents at that time of life is much more damaging than, it's not so awful for me and my husband to spend some time together in our house. It's not a big ask for us. It's a huge ask for children. And I think the evidence is showing that certainly some teenagers are suffering really badly. I also have real concerns about very, very young children. I really believe it takes a village to raise a child. And the idea of being completely dependent on your parents for all of the interaction, for babies and very young children is quite difficult for any parent to accommodate. I would say, I'm a mum of three. I didn't manage to meet every single one of my children's needs every single time. The burden didn't all fall on me. They had grannies and we were out socialising. So I think it's very, very difficult for very young children as well. We see also a particular impact on children with disabilities, where their families are really struggling to meet their needs and to help them to thrive. So there's absolutely right across government a recognition of how difficult this is for children and young people, the massive sacrifice that we're asking them to make. And that's why we're committed. Schools were the last place to close and they will be the first place to open.
I know that the Scottish Government have announced today funding to help teachers, especially new teachers within 4 years of their probation, who are maybe finding distance teaching quite difficult. They're providing support for them, counselling for them, which is good, and I'm sure teachers will be pleased about that. But I'm wondering actually whether it's maybe not the parents who are homeschooling that need that support rather than or as well as the teachers. It will be the usual. There'll be so many people requiring help and assistance post-COVID. We have to hope that the cake is big enough for everybody to get that support. Frederike, how is the Netherlands coping with the pandemic and how are people feeling there?
Well, the government is not managing it very well, to be honest. We're very low on the list of countries. The pace of vaccination is very, very low. It's a logistical nightmare. For example, in elderly people's homes, people fall into different groups. So one person in a home is getting a vaccine and the other one, their neighbor is not, because they fall into different categories. And that is being solved now, but there are a lot of problems like this. So the vaccination rate is really very low. And quite honestly, the government's making quite a mess of it, yes.
And where are you in terms of lockdown?
We're having a curfew now after 9 p.m. and there's been protest against it. They have turned violent as well, but they took it under control now. It has been quiet the last couple of nights, and it's kind of interesting to see also what it does to young people, because I think it contributes to inequality as well, that the schools are closed, which is the case in the Netherlands as well. I've heard of some people who have money enough to hire a teacher or a young person who's studying to be a teacher, to help with homeschooling. And other people, of course, don't have finances for that. And some families live in smaller homes with more children, and you cannot give them attention. You cannot give all of them attention, especially if you both work as well. So I think it's also increasing inequalities, and that's very worrying, of course.
And are your borders closed?
there are travel restrictions from some countries, but I'm not totally up to date on that because I'm not. There's nobody that I know who is abroad. I'm not planning to go abroad. I'm not sure about all the rules at the moment about flying in or.
Well, you mentioned vaccination and the fact that you're quite a low number of vaccinations happening in the Netherlands. Obviously, the vaccines have been major in the news this week. It even affected Brexit. We had the very brief closing of threat to close the Irish border from the EU, which was a bit of a shock, given that the no border in Ireland was a red line for the EU in the Brexit talks. They did it, and then they had a good think about it after the World Health Organization said they shouldn't do it, and everyone in Ireland got upset about it. But it's a slightly worrying precedent. I think the thing that is concerning me about the vaccines, Maree, is there's quite a lot of them. Why do we need so many to be developed? And isn't that just confusing for people?
So I guess if we think about this virus is it's only about a year ago that we defined what it was, understood what it was, recognised it as a coronavirus, and started to study the genetic makeup of it. I'm a pharmacist by trade. There has never been a vaccine for a coronavirus in history. They're quite common, they cause the common cold, but there's never been a successful vaccine. So when we started the vaccine quest, there was no certainty that anyone would be able to develop a vaccine for this virus. And the fact that we have successfully developed vaccines and the fact that they work, they're actually really effective, is really, really good. And I think it's, I don't think it's a bad thing that lots of different ones have been developed. I think the reality is at the moment we seem to be in a hideous escalation of vaccine nationalism, but the reality is we are going to need the whole world to be vaccinated against coronavirus. Nobody is going to be safe until everybody is safe. So we're going to need an awful lot of it.
Yes, but I understand the UK government have bought 367 million vaccines, or have ordered. Some of these vaccines not yet approved, not yet ready to be used. 367 million is the size of what we've bought. There's only 67 million of us live in the UK. So even accounting for 2 vaccines, that's 200% more than we actually need. So at what point does making sure that your own people are vaccinated first actually become morally unacceptable when there are poorer countries who can't access the vaccine? And only today, I think, the British government said, far too soon to be thinking about giving away our excess. Frederike, how do you feel about that? There's been a lot in the press about this so-called vaccination nationalism. Don't Western rich countries have a moral obligation to share what they have? Because as Maree says, no one's safe until everyone is safe.
Yeah, absolutely true. I just read an article in a South African newspaper that one of the vaccines was actually tested in South Africa on poorer people who volunteered to be in this research, but still, we're misusing poorer people to test, and then keeping the result for ourselves. It's very morally corrupted, of course, and yeah, it's true. It's with all of these. If not everybody is safe, then none of us is safe. It's very true. And if you have enough vaccine to vaccinate everybody 6 times, it doesn't make any sense. And we need to be more. We need more solidarity with poorer countries, but that's the current system just doesn't work this way.
Obviously, the UK, like other major Western democracies, including the States, have signed up to COVAX, which is the procurement platform, I guess you would call it, that is trying to help poorer countries access vaccines. But the more vaccines that ourselves or the EU or America order, the more that pushes COVAX down the list. So, Maree, what should we be doing? Should we be doing, as Norway is, donating some of our surplus, or at least making a commitment to do that?
So there's a couple of really big questions in there. One is a fundamental issue about how big pharma works and how ethical and moral it is to have a marketized system delivering drugs, life-saving drugs. So I worked for 20 years in psychiatry. The greatest sadness to me was that that is apparently not a market worth developing drugs for. And in the 20 years that I worked in mental health, there were very few major drug developments because these drugs are market driven. So we have to recognize that there are really big moral and ethical questions around drug development in general. In terms of vaccination, the pre-procurement, so pre-buying, underwrote the development of the drugs, and that enabled the drug companies to work as fast as they did. Normally it would take 10 years to develop a vaccine. They managed to do it in a year because so many governments had pre-purchased drug, regardless of whether it actually ever came to market or not. They poured the money into the pharmaceutical companies to underwrite the risk of developing those vaccines and the investment that was required to scale up production. So normally these trials that we're all hearing about, these phase 1, 2 and 3 trials, would happen one after the other. They were able to happen all at the same time because of the investment by pre-purchasing. So there's a question around that. There's a moral and ethical. That favouring rich countries has delivered a vaccine in a year.
So you're saying that big pharma, who have massive profits, couldn't have afforded to do any of that development from their own resources?
But we have a market system, and I'm no big fan of big pharma, and they do have massive profits. I mean, AstraZeneca actually have said that they're going to sell their vaccine at cost. Most of the other companies are selling it at profit, but these are big questions that I think we, as a country, as a world, need to wrestle with. Does this system deliver what we need for healthcare?
Well, I think it's just showing up the complete inequalities in healthcare across the world. I mean, it first came to light really with the whole issue of AIDS medication and Africa not being able to access AIDS medication at an appropriate level, and look what happened as a result of that. There's been a lot of talk that this pandemic is making us think differently. It's kind of making people work together more closely. But actually, it would appear that that's just nonsense. This basic model isn't going to change. And so we're still going to be left with these inequalities after it. What do you think about...
It's already, yeah. I think, when we say the richer countries have to help the poorer countries, that doesn't indicate equality, like I'm going to help you. That's not the key of equality. I also heard about that it's also about if you know how to make the vaccine, if the pharmaceutical companies give the recipe how to make it, then there's a lot of factories in India, for example, that could produce it, because some of these vaccines are not very hard to make, but you have to know how to make them. And if the pharmaceutical companies would give the recipe, then it could be produced elsewhere in the world as well. But they're not apparently willing to do that.
No, and that's just utterly appalling.
And
there's no one can force that to happen. There's no one that can make that happen. There's no one who controls these pharmaceutical companies to tell them that's required. Sorry, Maree, you were about to say something.
Yeah, just to be fair, I think Oxford AstraZeneca are collaborating with generic vaccine manufacturers in India and large-scale production there. But we have seen this issue before, and I do think it's an important one. So you're right. What we have seen is massive international collaboration and sharing of intelligence in a way that wouldn't normally happen in a market. So we have seen some shift, but we really need to consider what we want to shift and where we want it to shift to post this pandemic or through this pandemic. We did see it before. If you think about, there was a big battle. There was a very big battle in the past over HIV medicines, where India just broke international law to manufacture antiviral drugs in generic factories, and that shifted the debate dramatically and helped people to understand that you cannot hoard these drugs. We cannot have rich countries hoarding these medical developments for themselves. There has to be some ethics in it, but it comes in shifts and starts.
Yeah, I think it's one of the tragedies of the pandemic. What do you make, Frederike, of the falling out between the UK and the EU about the vaccines? Obviously this week, the EU published the contract between them and AstraZeneca and said that they're not getting the supplies that they were promised. Do you think this has been made worse by Brexit, or what do you think is going to happen as a result?
Sorry, I'm just not informed enough.
Okay.
Is it okay to say
Maree,
that?
have you been watching that fallout?
So, I think most people watched it. I would say it did get resolved pretty quickly on the night. So by the time we all went to bed on Friday night, the climb down had happened. But it did certainly, for me, gave me a bit of a jolt. Now, we're incredibly pro-European in Scotland. We voted to remain. We're not happy about Brexit, but we know the EU is not perfect, and there was clear indicators that the EU is not perfect on Friday. I mean, I guess one of the things that really dismays me about this whole discussion, so for the last week or so, we have all been talking about vaccines, and the vaccination in the UK is a really good story. It is a good story. Kate Birmingham did a brilliant job with procurement, and the rollout is going relatively well. But that does not hide from the fact that we have the worst death rate in the whole of Europe. And where is that story? We were late to every lockdown. We have a UK government that spent 22 billion on a failed test, trace and isolate system. In Scotland, we chose to invest in our NHS for our test and protect system. They gave the money to Serco and Cytel. We have given billions to people who are not experts. The UK has been very slow. So again, in Scotland, we learned from the first wave. We learned that you have to be fast, you have to be decisive, you have to make decisions before you're in crisis. We don't see that from the UK government. We saw all the children going back to school for a day after the Christmas holidays. I mean, it's really quite shocking. And it's ghoulish to be discussing this, but if England had the same death rate as Scotland has, there would be 30,000 English people alive today.
Mm-hmm.
And
to be fair, Maree, I think people in the UK, I think some of the UK media understand that difference and see that we've done things differently in Scotland, and certainly are very supportive of the First Minister's approach to keeping the people in Scotland informed in a way that just isn't happening down south. So you never see Boris Johnson occasionally, whereas, these daily briefings are making a difference to people. People feel informed in Scotland. And I think it's true that people do see that there's a difference. And people say we shouldn't politicise this. I know we shouldn't politicise it. We shouldn't look for political gain. But politics is in everything, every aspect of our life, and it's difficult not to. So on the subject of not politicising it, this week also saw the visit to Scotland, breaking COVID travel rules by Boris Johnson, supposedly to come and thank people on the front line in Scotland for what they were doing, and trying to make the case that it's because of the union that Scotland has managed to do so well, as if we were an independent country, we'd have said that we don't want a vaccine. Thanks very much. We're not going to furlough people if we had control of our own money. So, what did you make of Johnson's visit this week, Maree?
I mean, I have to say I found it pretty incomprehensible. I saw a Daily Record headline with Boris on the front of it saying travel ban, and I thought that pretty much encapsulated it. I'm finding it so. I have spent nearly a year wrestling with coronavirus, as every government minister has. I haven't visited a nursery. One of my most favourite things of my job was to visit children and young people, to go and visit nurseries, and I haven't done that in a year. Every time I leave the house, I think, do I have to do this? Can I do it another way? Can I make a remote visit? I too get real strength from visiting and speaking to individuals on the front line. I do that virtually now. I say thank you to people for I've got, in the next month, I've got a meeting with social workers and things. I want to say thank you to people, but I do that virtually now. And I just can't understand why in the middle of a national lockdown, you would travel the length of the country and go into 3 different workplaces, and all of that household mixing that entails is justified for what essentially looks like photo ops. And I suppose, like most people in Scotland, I'm pretty cynical. I think, they are rattled. There have now been 20 polls in a row showing support for independence, majority support for independence. It doesn't take a genius to understand why there are manoeuvres up here. So
Oh, but he admitted it. I mean, he briefed the Sun before he came and said it was to prove that the union was strong and it was the union that was saving people in Scotland. He was politicising it. He changed his tune a bit later. But I think the thing that he said when he was here that I found baffling was that independence was an irrelevance. Now, it's not an irrelevance for either side. The unionist side will crawl over broken glass to vote in a referendum, to vote no. So for his own side, that was a slap in the face. It's as if he doesn't understand. In a way that mainstream media in England is now acknowledging the opinion polls in Scotland, is now acknowledging that there will be very likely a landslide for the SNP in the May elections, and is acknowledging that Scotland's voice can't be ignored, and you can't just say no if the people of Scotland vote in an election on the basis that they want a referendum. He's still not prepared to accept that. Frederike, does Scottish independence appear on agendas in Europe, or is anyone talking about it in Europe? I mean, obviously everyone's talking about the pandemic just now, but is it relevant to people in Europe?
Well, it's relevant, but it's not really in the news yet, not in the Netherlands at least. I think that will come when the elections come, when there will be a referendum, of course, then it's going to be in the papers. And I do actually hope to contribute to that. I went to Turkey in 2006 as a freelance correspondent, and I also considered at the time to go to Scotland. Eventually I didn't, but now with all developments going on, I do consider to go. Actually, about a year ago, there was some march. I don't know the details anymore, but I have a Scottish, well, she's English, but she lives in Scotland. There was some historical march, and I was going to go there to make a story about it, but then the pandemic happened, and of course I couldn't go. But I would love to contribute to
Well, we would love to have you contribute, because in 2014, I was quite surprised, absolutely delighted at the number of European film crews who were here. In fact, the morning after the referendum, I was walking through George Square in Glasgow, and the sadness was palpable. And I was stopped by a German film crew who were just packing up and who were asking me how I'd voted and how I felt about it. And I said, after I came off camera, that I was quite surprised that so many European film crews had turned up, and I wondered why. And she said, we thought we were about to see the birth of a new nation. And I said, so did I, and I think we all burst into tears at that point. So we would love to have you. I mean, I think obviously in some European countries,
but that is also part of a nation being born, you could say, even though the referendum didn't get the outcome that maybe many people expected. It's part of also part of a process.
Yes, it's moved. It's helped us move to where we are now, and obviously Brexit's been a big help as well to moving us where we are now, where polls are consistently telling us there's a support for independence and that this will be the major battle in the election coming in May. I think the Sun today, or someone was reporting today, Maree, that there could be an independence referendum within 6 months of the May election. I think 6 months ago, Mike Russell said that on this programme, so you heard it on Broadcasting Scotland first. Do you think it would be possible by, say, October, November, after the election, to have a referendum? Are we ready? Is the grassroots movement ready? What do you think?
So I think the first thing to say is that the biggest priority for all of Scotland is the pandemic, and it is almost impossible to say now at the tail end of January where we're going to be and what position we're going to be in November, December this year even. We've had to cope with so much uncertainty over the last year, and I think it would be difficult to make promises about a referendum. What do I think is going to happen? I do think that Scotland will vote for a referendum. So the May elections, I think the Scottish people will return a majority in favour of independence. And then we will need to navigate that situation. I think what Mike Russell was saying about the 6-month limit was that it's, good practice to give 6 months notice of a referendum like that. And I would say that everything is in place for that to happen. So I think we could have, as soon as we are able to hold a democratic referendum, I think that we will.
Well, a sort of plan B has been announced about how we might proceed if there is a referendum majority after the election. Again, it will lie with courts, I suppose, so that is a bit unknown. I've just been handed some information that I think people need to be aware of. We've just heard that Glasgow's BBC Scotland office in Pacific Quay is on fire. Now, I wonder if that's some kind of, I hope no one's at risk, but I wonder if that's some kind of metaphor. Fire crews were called out just before noon. I believe it started in a utility room on top of the roof. There's no indication that anyone has been hurt in the fire or how long it's going to take to get under control. But that is a bit of a shock. So we'll see if we get any more news before we come off air, and we'll let you know what's happening with that. But I reiterate that I hope that no one is damaged. I'm imagining on a Sunday the building is not particularly full. It's not very full at the moment anyway because of the pandemic, but I hope everyone in the BBC is fine. I want to move the debate away from Scotland for a bit and cast a glance over what's happening in the United States. Broadcasting Scotland's been keeping a really close eye on the election and the fallout from the election. It would appear that Donald Trump's problems aren't lessening. The good citizens of Palm Beach have taken him to court, or his organisation at Mar-a-Lago to court. Apparently, when he bought the estate and then turned it into a money-making enterprise, he had to sign an agreement that no one would be able to stay at Mar-a-Lago for more than 21 days a year or more than a week at a time. Now, he has breached that himself while he was president. He did use it as a kind of summer White House or an alternative to Camp David. But of course, he's moved there permanently, is intending to stay. And the good people of Palm Beach have decided that's not on, and they have taken him to court. So he may be evicted, which is quite interesting. I wonder where he'll go. Let's hope it's not here, because of course he did threaten to move to Scotland. What do you make, Frederike, if you've been following it, of the first few days of Biden's presidency? He's done a lot to overturn some of the executive orders of Trump. What did you make of Biden? What did you think is going to be his biggest impact?
I saw a long list indeed of all of many of the worst Trump decisions that he reversed. At the same time, during the inauguration ceremony, and I saw many people getting so emotional about it, and even some Dutch people apparently crying over it. I really couldn't understand. I mean, you can only be a US president if you're totally entrenched into the system. So this is not going to mean the end of many tragedies in the United States. The growing inequality, police brutality, white supremacy so entrenched in the system. That's not going to miraculously go away just because they've gotten rid of the fascist in chief, we could say. So that was my thought. It's not something that I get totally emotional over. Not at least not emotional in a way of, oh, we're so happy now with Biden. That remains to be seen.
I think he has got a mountain to climb. Interestingly, though, he did actually call out white supremacists by name in his inauguration speech, which I thought was quite brave.
Yeah, but
it's
that
clear-
is that the bar? If you are calling out one of the biggest problems in the system, and we have to applaud that. You can name it, but you have to try to fight it, of course.
Well, that
So
has
it
to be
remains to be
hoped that by
seen if
naming
any
it,
action is going to follow.
he's going to. Well, and he's lucky. He's the first Democratic president in a long time to have control of both of the House and the Senate. And so
exactly, so we can hold him accountable, and he
well,
doesn't
we
have
can.
anything to hide behind. Also, yeah.
And I hope that people do, because I agree there was an outpouring of relief, obviously, when Trump lost the election. I do think it's meant that people have put unrealistic expectations on what Biden can and will do. But he's not probably going to have a second term because of his age. So really, he hasn't got his legacy to worry about. He really could go for it if he wanted to and make some difference. And of course, it tees up Kamala Harris nicely to be the first American woman of colour to be possibly president. So that has to be something that we need to champion and be pleased about. But I think what is slightly worrying, and it speaks to what you've just said, Frederike, is that there is still a huge number of his supporters, something like 65%, who are still voicing the belief that the election was rigged and are not going away. And despite the fact that Republicans voted to impeach him in Congress, 45 of the 50 Republican senators voted this week that there was no need for them to go ahead with an impeachment trial in the Senate on the basis that the American Constitution doesn't allow you to impeach someone who's out of office. So the chances of the trial convicting him, which would need 17 Republicans to vote with Democrats, is a bit unlikely, I think. Maree, are you as sort of cynical or unsure about Biden's presidency? Or do you have a bit more hope?
So I would have to say I tend to be an optimistic sort of person, so I have a fair amount of hope about this. I think it's I'm like the rest of the world, a collective sigh of relief that Donald Trump is no longer president of the US. I think Kamala Harris being vice president is just a brilliant, hopeful phenomenon for us all to hang on to. I don't think it's going to solve the US's problems overnight. I'm conscious that, more people voted for Trump. Was it over 70 million people voted for Trump? Huge level of support. And as Frederike says, there are some real challenges with inequality. Just healthcare, for example, it's an anathema in the US, and I struggle sometimes to put my feet in those shoes. It's not, I have some American cousins like most Scottish people, but I struggle to understand why a public healthcare system is a bad thing. And why people would argue against it. And I think at the moment in a pandemic, we can see just how important it is to have good quality, accessible public health, to have, social security that underpins society, makes it possible for people to follow public health guidance. There are massive challenges ahead in the US. It's a glorious and diverse country. There are hopeful signs. Trump is just, I thought actually one of the most hopeful things I thought, and I'm a big fan of poetry. I always think poetry is the power of well chosen words. And on the day of the inauguration, my Twitter timeline was full of poetry, and that young poet who just blew everyone away, just absolutely phenomenal, well chosen words, and just the very opposite of Donald Trump. We've had 4 years of inflammatory language, appalling, unpresidential behaviour. I mean, thank heavens he's gone.
Yeah, she was spectacular, actually. She was the highlight.
Can I say something?
Yeah, surely.
I do want to correct. You said you asked her if she had more hope than I have. It's not that I don't have hope. I have a lot of hope, but my hope is not in the president of the United States. How can the hope be in that position? The hope is in what she said, like the people, like the young woman who read the poem, in the Black Lives Matter movement, in people who are really dedicated in changing the system. That's where my hope is.
But maybe these people will feel they've got more opportunity to have their voices heard now under a Biden presidency than they did under Trump. I mean,
Maybe, I
followed the
not
American
hopeless,
election.
but my hope is somewhere else. Yeah.
Yeah, I followed the American election. I just love elections. It's my thing. But I always, even while I was doing it, I kept thinking, why am I so concerned about this? I reject absolutely this view that America was ever great, that America has some automatic right to be the world's policeman, that actually the United States is a force for good in the world. Because I think we've seen time and time again that is not the case. In some ways, it's a morally bankrupt country. It's a country that still kills its own citizens. It's a country that kills its minors in 26 states. And I think we need to be very, very careful of that. And it's a country that wouldn't be allowed to join the EU, for heaven's sake, because of some of its policies. And I think certainly during the Trump years, that division between the new world and the old world seemed stronger than ever. So I'm hoping, my hope is that the good in the United States, the good people, the good causes have a bit more opportunity to be heard. And that would be a fantastic legacy. And like you both, Kamala Harris as vice president is wonderful, and she may become president, but heavens above, they're a bit late to the scene with having women in power. It's not news in Europe. It's not news across the world. There are women in the developing world who are running countries, women in Europe who are running countries. The fact that this is big news in America, it's pretty damning, really. Sorry, Frederike.
Not in the Netherlands.
Not in the Netherlands, but elsewhere in Europe that there are. But I think more importantly, in developing world, in Africa and in the Far East and the Middle East as well, women coming to the fore, which is great. So I want now to turn to back to Europe. Obviously, this week was Holocaust Memorial Day. One of the reasons we mark the Holocaust is not just because of the appalling things that happened during it and the huge numbers who died, but it's so that we don't forget, presumably so it doesn't happen again. But of course, the reality is it has continued to happen. Genocide didn't stop in 1945. There have been 12 major genocides in the world since 1945, and that doesn't include ethnic cleansing. It doesn't include what we're going to talk about in a little while, which is political genocide, nor does it include minorities being repressed by regimes. It's gone on. It's as if we haven't learned anything. Now, Frederike, we're lucky to have you on the programme today because, as I said at the beginning of the show, you're an expert on Kurdistan. And I'd like, if you could, in the 15 minutes that we've got left, just to talk a little bit about what you referred to before we came on air to me of the political genocide that's happening to the Kurds and the pressures on the Kurdish movement at the moment, and especially the impact on women.
Yeah, let me first mention that one of the genocides that is currently still going on is the Yazidi genocide. It started in 2014 in the northwest of Iraq when ISIS advanced into the land of the Yazidis, a religious minority in Iraq, and killed thousands of men and abducted children and women, and thousands of women are still missing. They've been enslaved and raped, and this is still ongoing, and the pressure on the Yazidis is still ongoing currently, also by Turkey. So that is one of the actual genocides of our days that is still continuing. And the term that I used, the political genocide, it's not really a term that I use as a journalist because it needs so much explanation. It's a term that the Kurdish movement uses for the crackdown on their political movement, and Turkey is really trying to root it out. There are thousands and thousands of Kurdish activists in Turkey in jail, also elected officials, mayors of towns and cities in the southeast of the country. And the Kurdish movement refers to this as the political genocide. And it is also very much, Turkey also targets women, because women have a very prominent role in the Kurdish movement, because it's a very feminist movement. And a friend of mine was arrested last week, Ayşe Gökhan. She was mayor of a town at the Syrian border years ago. That's when I met her for the first time. And she's been in the Kurdish women's movement, and she's been arrested now, and she's been detained more than 80 times in her life. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of judicial investigations against her. But she keeps on going with her activism, just as the Kurdish movement is. They are very convinced of their goal and very dedicated to their goal. So they're insisting and they're pushing through, and that's why they are all repeatedly arrested and jailed and prosecuted. I very much admire them for their dedication. And they will never be stopped by this kind of policies. But that is that's ongoing currently now as we speak. Yeah.
And what is it, do you think, why you say that the Kurdish movement is a feminist movement? Why have women become so important in the movement? Because I think that's something people maybe didn't realize. I didn't until we began speaking.
Yeah, they are trying to fight power structures. So they're fighting. That's a very interesting difference between Scotland and Kurdistan, because part of the Kurdish movement wants an independent Kurdish state, but the Kurdish movement in Turkey and in Syria doesn't want that. They say we have to decentralize and give people power on a very local level. So neighborhood councils, town councils, village councils, with all the groups living there having a representation, and also a very good representation of women. So they actively campaign against nation states. Mm-hmm. They say we will only repeat the mistakes that other nation states make, which is one language, one history, one flag, one nation, and that always leads to suppression of some group in society. So we need to break down these power systems, and nation states are patriarchal systems. So we need to advance to a more community-based society, which they consider to be more rooted in feminine way of living. And it's interesting because I saw a Scottish man, I don't know who he was, but I saw a short video also commenting on Boris Johnson's visit to Scotland. And he was very passionate about defending the community-based society that Scotland is, as he described it, and that is very much in line with what I know from Kurdistan. And they say that is in Kurdistan. They say this is what we have to make stronger, not a centrally governed state. And now in Scotland there's a movement towards independence, and this of course has to do with Brexit. And you want to live in another system that the United Kingdom just doesn't provide. But at the same time, there's a danger of nationalism always, of course. And I would very much be interested to investigate that. If I would be reporting in Scotland, that would always be in the back of my mind. How would you make sure that your nationalism doesn't recreate power structures that get people in trouble? That would always be in the back of my mind.
Well, I think that's a question then we can put to Maree. But I think I would answer it by saying that the nationalism in Scotland that has the upper hand is civic nationalism rather than ethnic nationalism.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
But Maree, that's an interesting challenge. How do we make sure in an independent Scotland we simply don't replicate the patriarchal structures that other nation states have had? That's a very big question, I appreciate. But, let's start that
minutes,
debate.
Please.
Well, first of all, the driving force is about democracy. It really is about self-determination. So for me, the whole question of independence is not about shifting the power from London to Edinburgh. It is about bringing the power back to the people. And of course, I was reflecting on this just this week when I was thinking that I'm 48 this year. For only 18 years of my life have we had a government in Scotland that we voted for. For 30 years, Scotland has had a government that England has chosen. And I just find that remarkable. For me, it is about the power coming back to the people, coming right, and frankly, as a Highlands and Islands representative, I am not going to be able to look my people in the eye if all we do is deliver power to Edinburgh, which is quite far away as well, nearly as far as London. I want to see us flourish, and I don't think we can under the current system. So my yearning is to disrupt the systems that we have at the moment. You look at, for example, one of the things that really holds us back in the Highlands and Islands is the pattern of land ownership. Really difficult to change that without the powers of independence. Really difficult to change. We've got a massive asset in terms of renewable energy. We can harness that energy, we can turn it into electricity, but we're dependent on a different country to utilize that asset to its full potential. And that could be transformative for the people in the Highlands and Islands. So for me, it's all about us flourishing, as being empowered, as getting the government that we vote for, getting the government as a country that we choose for. And I have no interest at all in ethnic nationalism. Actually, Scotland itself is culturally quite diverse. I come from a Gaelic-speaking part of the country. I think it's interesting that such a small country is so, has not got a single identity. We're not monolingual even, and oh boy, we love. One of the reasons we're so opposed to Brexit is the reduction in free movement. We recognise up here, particularly where there's been a long history of depopulation, being able to attract people in, and how much they contribute, not just financially, not just economically, but socially to the fabric of our communities. I would like to think that recognition and the fact that political leaders are willing to stand up and say that, will guard us against any sort of ethnic nationalism post-independence.
There's been a number of surveys done on sort of attitudes in Scotland, people's attitudes in Scotland, and there is, according to the research, no real difference in our attitudes to, say, immigration as a people than there is down south. I think the difference is it isn't part of the political discourse in Scotland. politicians do not make political capital out of immigration. They just don't. And that's possibly because the media hasn't been able to inflame that in the way that it has down south. And I would agree with Maree that when it comes to Scottish independence, we are not short on the vision. But like everyone, I'm concerned that once we get it, that we don't just produce the same country that we have under a different flag, because that isn't why I support independence. And I would say that I'm not a nationalist. I'm a supporter of independence, and I see a difference, because I think it's true that within a European context, the whole concept of nationalism is complicated. I remember when the SNP first got the majority in 2010, so many European colleagues got in touch and said, "Oh, we're so sorry," because they understood Scottish Nationalist Party as being a right-wing nationalist party. And I think it's unfortunate that the party has the name in a way. And I know that even the First Minister's often said she wishes it was called something else. I'm really interested, though. I'm really interested in this whole issue of women. So I sit on the National Committee of Women for Independence, who are one of the big grassroots movements who absolutely believe that the rights of women and girls can only meet their full potential under a different system, under an independent Scotland. And that's very much about breaking down the patriarchy. It's very much about decentralising power. So I'm quite interested to get back to what you were saying about the women in Kurdistan. What do you think is the biggest change that could happen in the Kurdish movement to improve the lives of women and girls in the next, say, 2 or 3 years?
In the next 2 or 3 years, it's a very long-term battle, actually, and the Kurdish movement has come from very far already, because traditionally the clan system, very patriarchal clan system, is very strong in Kurdistan, and that has changed a lot already since 30, 40 years. And what the Kurdish movement has done, for example, is to always have co-leaderships on every position. So there's always a man and a woman in charge together. But also, for example, in parts of southeast Turkey where there are still Christian minorities, also the Christians have a place. And I hear so many stories, and when I hear Maree talk, I want to make so many stories only based on what I've heard now. The diversity needs to be respected, and I see that I see so many similarities. That is your wish in Scotland too. That you cannot. The Kurdish movement says in the Middle East as a whole, not just Kurdistan, but the whole Middle East, it is so diverse that you can never have really a nation state, because whichever country you carve out, there you will be cutting through somebody's land or somebody's ancestral lands, or so you will have to. The decentralization is meant to respect that diversity, and not only ethnically but also linguistically, which is also what I hear from Maree, that you have a linguistic diversity. And respecting this goes hand in hand with respecting women's rights as well. It's all connected to each other, and that is what the Kurdish movement is investing in. And it's also doing very well for girls, because they see that they can be in positions, not positions necessarily of power, but positions where they can contribute to their community and to their society and make a change. And girls in Kurdistan see that now, and that is very big and very important.
So what's going to need to happen in order for the Kurdish movement to achieve its aims? And we are just, most of us, fixated on the idea of nation states. It's just the way we live. So how are they going to achieve those aims out with that sort of structure? What's going to need to happen?
In Turkey, they really need They need a new constitution where and get rid of the presidential system again, radically decentralize not only the southeast, because Turkey is a big country. In the west, people vote differently as well. They don't vote for President Erdogan either. And in the north of the country, the Black Sea coast, there's a lot of resistance against hydroelectric plants because nature is very the local communities want nature to be preserved. So all the regions in Turkey need more control over their own communities, their own towns, their own nature reserves. But that's in Turkey, that is already considered separatism to say this. And separatism is terrorism. So what needs to be done also is to get the separatism and the terrorism stamp of everything that you do, to give more power to local communities. Immediately, people in power in Turkey say that is separatism and terrorism. And that is stifling every progress towards more democracy. But that's very hard.
I think the British government would certainly they wouldn't use the word terrorism about Scotland, but they do use the word separatism in a negative way.
Yeah.
And on that rather uplifting idea that the future lies with empowered communities, and the future lies with women being central to that, I'm going to thank you both very much for being on the programme this morning. And I do hope, Frederike, that we will see you back in Scotland physically when we are moving towards another independence referendum, and your insight would be tremendously important. And I'm very, very interested personally on the links and the possible synergies between the Kurdish movement and women and what we're doing in Scotland with women. I think there's something there. So thank you both very much indeed. Just to remind you, it takes money to make this programme and to make all the programmes that Broadcasting Scotland do. We are an independent journalistic outfit, and that's important that we have that, but it does take money. So please support Broadcasting Scotland. Go online, www.broadcastingscotland.scot/register to donate to the crowdfunder, to become a regular donor. It's much, much appreciated. We are doing well. We've got a big job coming up to cover the election and any forthcoming referendum, so we do need your support. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Catalans, the Basques, the Galicians in the Basque.
An independent future for Scotland.
How quickly do you think a referendum can be arranged?
Best practice demands that it should be 6 months.
Just looking at the overall share numbers for Scotland at the moment, the SNP 46.4%.